Welcome to Angels and Seerstones presents Demons and Pendulums, a podcast on Chad Daybell and the teachings that led to the murders of J.J. Vallow, Tylee Ryan, Charles Vallow, and Tammy Daybell. I'm Chris Blythe. I'm a folklore professor from Brigham Young University, and I study Latter-day Saint story and belief. The goal of this limited series is to contextualize Daybell's beliefs that led to the disturbing chain of events that we've all become familiar with over the past years. Last week, we left off talking about how Lori Vallow saw herself as a person who was becoming immortal. And we talked about her claims to have seen Jesus Christ face to face. This episode is on Chad Daybell's teachings on demons and exorcism. Truly, this is the most important conversation we can have when it comes to figuring out how Chad and Lori justified their crimes. Before we get started, just a reminder that this is a fundraiser to cover our expenses in 2025. We are so grateful for those of you that have donated. I am blown away by the generosity and support of our audience. To donate, you can Venmo us at Angels and Seerstones, and you can always show your support for the show by subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. If you're listening on YouTube, please comment. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, then visit our Instagram and comment there. In fact, you can help me out. While the series ends in a couple weeks, I've decided to do a few mini episodes on topics I haven't been able to cover yet. Next week, I'll drop one that was meant to come out last month on why Lori believed the apocalypse was going to occur in the summer of 2020. But there are all sorts of topics we could dig into. Is there something you want to know more about? Let me know. When you try to introduce so much new material, it helps to give listeners an idea of my plans for the episode. First thing I'm going to discuss is the beliefs and demons among everyday Latter-day Saints and in the history of Latter-day Saints. Then I'll talk about what we actually know about Chad Daybell's beliefs. And finally, I'm going to dive into the writings of Douglas Mendenhall, who I believe was the first voice on the Latter-day Saint fringe to really emphasize this new energy work-inspired exorcism ceremonies. I can't show that Chad was influenced directly by Doug, but Doug started a conversation that was continued by Julie Rowe, Mike Stroud, and an anonymous author of a very influential website called Pure Revelations. So let's get started. There is a theology of demons in the Latter-day Saint tradition, what has traditionally been called in Christianity a demonology. If you're just looking for a discussion of Chad Daybell, you can probably skip ahead a bit, but this is fascinating material and key to understanding Chad's worldview. So Joseph Smith taught that we existed before we were born as spirits. The vast population of God's children prepared for mortality so they could become like God. There was a conflict among them when there was a debate over who would serve as the savior of the world. Would it be Jesus or would it be Lucifer? All the spirits either decided to follow Christ or the devil. In what the book of Revelation calls the war in heaven, those who followed the devil were cast out of heaven and would not have bodies. This is the pivotal moment in Latter-day Saint mythology. I use the word mythology even though I'm a Latter-day Saint and I believe this story. Mythology just means a sacred narrative that explains how things came to be as they are. And this one is important. It tells us that all of us were once on Christ's side, which, as we discussed, Chad Daybell, while he embraces the vast majority of the sort of worldview of evil spirits that Joseph Smith discussed, he doesn't hold this idea. Human beings might be on the devil's side, even from birth. All right, let's read a passage from a vision that Joseph Smith had in 1832. Smith writes, "We saw and bear record that an angel of God who was in authority in the presence of God, who rebelled against the only begotten Son, whom the Father loved, and who was in the bosom of the Father, was thrust down from the presence of God and the Son, and was called Perdition, for the heavens wept over him. He was Lucifer, a son of the morning, and we beheld, and lo, he is fallen, even a son of the morning. And while we were yet in the Spirit, Lord commanded us that we should write the vision, for we beheld Satan, the old serpent, even the devil, who rebelled against God, and sought to take the kingdom of our God and his Christ. Wherefore he maketh war with the saints of God, and encompasseth them round about." That's in Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. You'll notice that last line. Latter-day Saints believe this spiritual conflict continues on earth. Satan wants us to be miserable like him, so his angels, as they're sometimes called, tempt and deceive mankind. Latter-day Saints also believe in encounters with evil spirits, possession, and exorcism. It's not likely you're going to hear a Latter-day Saint use that term, exorcism, or even possession. This isn't a major part of the faith. However, missionaries sometimes encounter individuals who believe they're possessed. And you might read about possessions in church history, or hear a contemporary legend of someone who's been possessed. You might have a conversation about the reality of possession after seeing a horror movie, but the average member isn't going to see possession during their life, or even hear a sermon that discusses possession in any detail. It's more common for Latter-day Saints to believe they've been subject to supernatural assault, particularly in reference to the common experience of sleep paralysis. You can listen to the 1st and 6th episodes of Angels and Seer Stones to learn about stories of Latter-day Saints encountering evil spirits. Back in 2020, I really upset a friend of mine, a Pentecostal theologian, because in an interview, I said that Chad Daybell's emphasis on demons seemed foreign to the Latter-day Saint tradition. From my perspective, it had more in common with Pentecostal deliverance ministry. My friend told me that he was familiar with comments and experiences of possession in the early Latter-day Saint faith. And my friend was right. There is a lot of theology in early Latter-day Saint discourse about evil spirits. Joseph Smith taught that God gave us bodies in part to protect us from evil, and that evil spirits wanted to possess our bodies because they were deprived of them. There's a common idea that when you are faced with an evil spirit, that you raise your right arm to the square and order the spirit to depart in the name of Jesus Christ. The idea of casting out an evil spirit in the name of Jesus is biblical, but this idea of raising your right arm to the square is specifically Latter-day Saints, so far as I'm aware. You wouldn't find these instructions for casting out in an official manual from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but it is a common belief. One of my favorite paintings of Christ facing the Gerasene demoniac is from a Latter-day Saint artist from Argentina named Jorge Coco. The Gerasene demoniac is the man who is possessed with the evil spirits that identify themselves as Legion. And of course, I bring this up because this painting shows Christ lifting his right arm to the square. So the general idea of a casting out evil spirits, is part of a well-known established vernacular tradition, folk tradition, among Latter-day Saints. Now, at the same time, there's some real skepticism among Latter-day Saints when someone claims to have seen the devil or has met a possessed person. The basic ideas are accepted, but no one is expecting to run into evil spirits on a regular basis. I'm not aware of any Latter-day Saint movement through the history of the faith that are as demon-obsessed as Chad Daybell and his friends. Generally, Latter-day Saints have gotten the idea that they're not supposed to discuss the devil in too much detail. When I teach folklore involving the devil in my classes at Brigham Young University, I'll usually have a student or two express how deeply uncomfortable with the conversation they are. They're reflecting an ancient idea. Speak of the devil and he appears is the basis for why Harry Potter shouldn't say Voldemort's name. But Latter-day Saint demonology is actually robust, and it's a complex topic. That said, this is enough of a primer for today. You can listen to episodes of Angels and Seer Stones to learn more, or you can read an article I published with the Journal of Religion, The Exorcism of Isaac Russell, which is available online on academia.edu. All right, so what do we know about Chad and Lori's demonology? They believe that evil spirits can possess or take over a person's body immediately after they die. There are hierarchies of evil spirits, some more terrible than others. There are 3 types of evil spirits. They have demons. These are those that followed Lucifer before the world began. They're disembodied spirits. That means ghosts. And finally, there's what Chad called slugs or worms, which is another type of creature that enters the body. There's also a satanic hierarchy on earth in which some people are the reincarnation of evil individuals from the past. Chad labeled people dark or light. A person is dark when they've made a contract with what Chad called the dark side. In other words, a dark person is someone who has sold their soul to the devil. There are 2 major areas of confusion around this idea. First, people have been confused because there's a scale associated with different individuals. For example, Tylee Ryan was labeled as 4.1 dark. I'm going to talk about reincarnation next time, but that's what the scale's about. We start as spirits in the first estate. We're then born in the second estate. Chad suggests that some people come back for a third estate and then a fourth estate, and much fewer come back for a fifth estate and finally a sixth estate. So when someone was a 4.1 dark, it meant that they were on their first lifetime as a fourth estate being. If this is clear as mud, I hope it'll make more sense after the next episode. But the key here is that this scale is different than Chad's vibrations or death scales, which could increase or decrease in your lifetime. This was about something innately part of your nature. Before this life, or maybe in this life, you have made an agreement with the devil. And while if you made this agreement in the second or third estate, you might change your mind. In the fourth estate, Chad declared that this status of dark or light was usually permanent to your identity. As a Latter-day Saint, this is something I find particularly objectionable. One of the revelations Joseph Smith received states, "Every spirit of man was innocent in the beginning. You come to earth pure." This is the Latter-day Saint story. So Chad doesn't like this. We know that Chad identified two individuals as evil beings from the past. First, Kim Jong-un of North Korea is a reincarnation of the quintessential evil king in the Book of Mormon, King Noah. One of the detectives in Rexburg, Idaho, Detective Hermosillo, was identified as a translated immortal follower of Cain. If I get some requests for a special episode diving into the topic of Cain's immortal followers, I'll do a short episode on the topic. It's undeniably fascinating, but I'm not going to cover it in this episode. There's just too much to talk about. One of the ongoing confusions surrounding Chad's theology is about the relationship between someone being dark and someone being a zombie. But Daybell didn't think people who were dark were zombies, not necessarily. Chad Daybell's idea of a zombie is not that different from the concept as it appears in popular culture. When you watch The Walking Dead or some other zombie movie, a zombie is a reanimated corpse. We all know this. Chad believed that evil spirits were possessing corpses, or perhaps that someone was possessed and then the evil spirits killed the host to fully take over. So Tammy Daybell and Charles Vallow aren't initially dark in Chad's rankings. Instead, they are possessed, and eventually their own spirits have been ousted and can't be brought back. The spirit has gone on to limbo until the body can be destroyed. When someone's dark, they're more a witch, right? They've made a contract with Satan. But when they're a zombie, the good spirit is in the afterlife in limbo, waiting to go to the light in Chad's rhetoric. Whereas the person that you see, the body, actually has nothing to do with that spirit anymore, other than the body somehow tethers it to mortality so it can't move on. Of course, none of this is Latter-day Saint theology that any Orthodox Latter-day Saint throughout the history of the movement, and there are many different churches in the Latter-day Saint tradition, none of these churches would accept this idea of zombies. The way to combat these creatures is through a group ceremony that Chad and his followers call the casting. Casting sounds like it could be a reference to spell casting, but it's actually a shortened reference to, quote, casting out evil spirits. And that's how exorcism or deliverance is referred to in the King James Version of the Bible. For years, law enforcement have asked those involved in Lori's casting group to describe the process they went through. The best account of this process was given recently in the testimony of Zulema Pastenes in Chad Daybell's trial. Check this out.
This would be the order in which a casting would be performed. The first one would be by the order of the priesthood. Then two would be the spell and encapsulate, cast out, burn, scorter and sealed. Then the spell, banish, expel, eject, purge, and evict.
So was this all part of the casting, or was this an order of things that you'd try first?
This was done during the casting.
So there it is. There's a formula. I don't know what all these terms mean. People play different roles, and perhaps they each take turns performing one of these steps. For example, Zulema was given a gift of spiritual fire. That probably means that she was the individual in charge of burning the spirit. Alex Cox was present for one of these castings in which he played the role of warrior. I suspect that has to do with the use of spiritual weapons. On May 5th, 2019, Lori texted Zulema to ask for, quote, a list of the powers we are going to use in that week's casting. Zulema responded, quote, crystals, vibrating fire, ice, water, lightning, wind, stormy sky, fiery cherubim. I feel the ice is going to be the most crucial because, as Mel said, it paralyzes them, end quote. I think that final comment is really interesting. It means that these women were actively imagining the spiritual conflict unfolding and how each of these invisible weapons functioned. The ice paralyzes. Finally, in these ceremonies, Lori seals the casting. And that just means she says, "I seal this casting," by the authority of the priesthood. I never heard of sealing as part of a Latter-day Saint exorcism ceremony, but one seals an anointing as part of the Latter-day Saint healing ceremony, so it develops from that. And Lori does this because she holds the priesthood and is presiding over the ritual. My ongoing question is, where does this stuff come from? If you're not a Latter-day Saint, you might think a Latter-day Saint, such as myself, will be able to answer this question. But if they haven't encountered the circles that Chad and Lori were part of, they'd have no clue. One of the key points I want to make in this limited series is that there's a circle of Latter-day Saint voices on the fringe of the faith that are in conversation with each other on different topics. I say fringe because while you might find 2 or 3 families in a Latter-day Saint congregation who shares or is at least familiar with these speculative theological ideas, no one is pretending these are mainstream. Proponents know that these aren't church teachings, and so much that you couldn't find them discussed in official settings, in the materials published by the church or in the sermons of church leaders given at the semi-annual general conference. The internet has been key in bringing together those interested in these fringe ideas and also in creating a dialogue between the types of teachers I'm talking about. Of course, Chad Daybell would be one of these voices, but there were and there are many. The reason I bring this up is because I'm currently thinking a lot about Chad's influences. And the fact is that you can pinpoint obvious influences, but really he's pulling from a dialogue that is occurring widely in these circles. For example, on the issue of possession and exorcism, this new Latter-day Saint demonology from which Chad's ideas would spawn seems to have been promoted by Mike Stroud, Julie Rowe, an anonymous author who writes a blog called Pure Revelations, and Douglas Mendenhall. Now, these teachers are not interested in presenting their ideas as a dialogue with each other. Part of their shtick is that they present new information. Sometimes they mention other visionaries, but for the most part, their knowledge is just presented as absolute truth. Over the past 10 or 15 years, the conversation of evil spirits and supernatural conflict has dominated these discussions. I believe much of this began with a man named Douglas Mendenhall from Central Utah. Mendenhall was one of the earliest advocates for deliverance ministry and spiritual warfare. He was the first in these circles to openly merge teachings of energy work with traditional Latter-day Saint demonology, for lack of a better word. Mendenhall published a fairly popular work in the LDS Fringe, 2012, Conquering Spiritual Evil, and he published many others as well. Mendenhall's daughter, Denise, went into a diabetic coma when she was around 9 or 10. After her recovery, Denise and her family came to believe that she no longer had a veil separating her from the supernatural world. Over the next 2 decades, Mendenhall accumulated knowledge from interviewing his daughter, who seemed just short of all knowledgeable. Doug recorded these experiences in a series of books. He'd couple what he learned from his daughter from other relationships he had with visionaries and energy healers. In fact, Doug began to see himself as an exorcist in energy work. He ran a series of seminars, first called the Ezekiel Seminar, and later called the Jedi Workshop, where attendees practiced trying to bend spoons with their minds as they listened to Doug's lectures. And Doug was an interesting guy. He'd eventually come to follow Denver Snuffer, who began his own expression of the Latter-day Saint tradition after his 2014 excommunication. I've mentioned Denver in the past. You'll remember his movement had it start largely around obtaining the second comforter, of explaining to people why they should be able to access Jesus Christ, literally, physically in front of them, and how that could come about by following Denver Snuffer's formula. There's a lot I could say about Doug and Denise Mendenhall's demonology and how I believed it influenced Chad Daybell, but I'm going to just pinpoint a few ideas. First, the same 3 species of evil spirits that we talked about that Chad holds shows up in Mendenhall's writings, as it does in Mike Stroud's and others. Mendenhall states that there are earthbound spirits, quote, people who have died but have not moved on from the plane of existence to the spirit world. This is, of course, what Chad called disembodied. There are, quote, devils, who are the traditional evil spirits that followed Lucifer. And finally, there are, quote, demons, who are beings created by Satan in his realm, what Chad called these worms or slugs. Mendenhall does not believe in reincarnation, so there's some differences with Chad. But he does have a ranking system of evil spirits graded with numbers 1 through 9. A number 1 is a spirit that might cause you some mild discomfort or pain. He talks about whenever he judges someone, he gets a pain in his knee, and this is a demon that's in charge of that. A 9 is a general of hell, however. He's like Satan or Lucifer, who's much more difficult to defeat and much more sinister in their agenda. Spiritual weapons are a big deal in Mendenhall's writings. He talks about having been given a spiritual sword that stays on his back and that he can withdraw with God's permission. He mentions the reality of evil weapons, the fiery darts of the adversary, and devices or weapons used by evil spirits implanted on the faithful. On multiple occasions, Chad Daybell spoke of finding devices on individuals or using his spiritual sword to help them fight an evil spirit. Many times in their writings, the Mendenhalls talk about the dangers of evil spirits to children. Remember, Latter-day Saints think children are sinless until the age of accountability, which is 8. Mankind comes with good spirits in them. The Book of Mormon makes it clear that the very idea that an infant would go to hell because they weren't baptized is an evil one. That there is something truly wrong with a person who could believe such a thing. But Denise and Doug spent quite a bit of time discussing spiritual dangers to children. Disney can lead to possession, they'd say. Anger could lead to possession. Doug believed you could tell that a child's been encountering evil entities if they talk about having imaginary friends. When a child is still in the womb, the mother's emotions can cause attachments with evil spirits. Doug recommends that one, quote, might consider taking a newborn infant in their arms and blessing it and even casting out if the spirit tells us to. This advice would be shocking to an Orthodox Latter-day Saint who believes a newborn baby is pure. The most radical idea that Denise introduced was based on an experience that happened after she had her first child. This is what she writes. The day I got out of the hospital, my husband and I separated. My dad got told by the spirit that he needed to put a shield around my baby daughter or they would come up from hell and take her. What happens is that demons would come up from hell and take the baby's spirit to hell and put a demon spirit in her body. This could be for a few hours, days, weeks, or months. They were trying to possess the baby with demons. The Lord said it's our fault because we give up our stewardship. For example, when you give up your kids to the nurse or medical person and tell them you're too tired to take care of the baby, you have given up your stewardship to others. Some of the babies are taught to be evil while in hell. This is the classic description of a changeling we discussed in episode 2. Evil spirits or fairies or trolls take your child's spirit away and replace them with one of their own. And of course, you can tell when the child is replaced because it never stops crying. When I read these writings, including Chad and Lori's discussions of the children that they want to present as zombies, it seems to me that the doctrine is really pretty simple. When children annoy us, they're little demons. As Doug mentions again and again in his writings, their misbehavior is assisted by evil spirits at the very least. While I don't have a photograph of Chad Daybell or Lori Vallow in swimsuits or reading the writings of Douglas Mendenhall, as I do with John Pontius's Visions of Glory, the ideas that Doug perpetuated, as well as Denise, found their way to them either through a direct reading of their books or filtered through Mike Stroud, Julie Rowe, or the Pure Revelations blog, who shared many of these same ideas. Likely Chad was familiar with all of these voices. I'd be shocked if he wasn't. Thank you for joining us this week. We will be back very shortly with episode 8, all about Chad Daybell's theology of reincarnation.